Heavenly Father, we thank you for coming together to discuss the conclusion of our topic on dress reform. We pray for your Holy Spirit's leading and guidance and teaching is our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we are continuing where we left off, and we are looking at tight clothing. Tight clothing. Tight clothing is any article of clothing that shows and clearly defines the form of the body. So it may be fitted tight, or it could be clung to the body and so display the shape, every bit of curves and so forth of the body. Clothing rather should fit well, but not so well that underwear lines are visible, or even worse, that your anatomical features of the feminine or the masculine form are plainly visible and clearly defined. So you should have your clothing that is a little bit more loose on the body. So you do have men as well as women wearing tight clothes. And so men, they can have, the tight trousers. Then they may have shorts that's tight. You see sometimes they have these spandex fitted shorts, or even just an ordinary church pants that can be so close to the skin that you're seeing all the anatomy and everything. You have the swimming trunks, unbuttoned shirts, low-cut necks, those muscle shirts that fit them tightly, and they do display the body forms, and it is assumed that it looks attractive, and the purpose is to attract the female, or that they look attractive to the world. Then our ladies, on the other hand, too, you could have your blouse that has buttons down the front. It could be tight. You could have sweaters or clingy fabrics, the straight skirts that's fitted, and especially if a woman has, a lot of blessings in their buttocks, where you find that, you have these clinging skirts, and then you might have a short top with that. So all of the behind is showing and exposed with the fabric that just rests on it, and nothing is loose. So the entire form is being displayed. Men, when they have their pants that's too tight in the crotch, it endangers the delicate testes. It tends to get too hot within that area, and there's injury from the compression and the excessive heat that is compared to the X-ray radiation. If you were placed on an X-ray, that kind of heat that would exhibit under there, or some radiation treatment. It is too much for the testes. It's cooler, it's an extended part of the body, and so it's usually cooler than the main core, and therefore that part should not be so heated up. So what could also constitute tight clothing? If you have bands about the waist, like belts, or a tight waistband, it would actually leave the mark on the skin that is tight. And so you want to rather prevent having those tight bands about the belly, the waistline, so that your organs can move about and have their normal function properly without being constricted. The most helpful clothing is rather suspended from the shoulder rather than tight bands around the waist. Care should also be used at such trouble areas as the necklines and the knees and the thighs and waist area, that they should not be tight. So test your clothing by lifting up your arms and see that your clothing moves up with you then you know, okay, it's loose enough and not that tight. So the tight clothing, you also have that it can reveal the shape and form. Women with large breasts need to be mindful of these fitting clothing, which will also cause, their body part to be displayed. So we're looking at corsets, which is another article of clothing that some individuals will try to use, especially if you think you want to have some more shape in that upper body, and or the design of the dress may have a corset within it. So these corsets actually have panels and they have wires within them to set the fabric in place. They will have zips. Sometimes they have lacing behind that you pull together. And so the corset would fit tightly about the chest, that abdomen, and keep that belly flat in. And whereas it may be used for such purposes, it is not something that a woman or a man should use. And I'm saying men because remember, men are now using women's clothing, and I've known of a man who would use corset because just to have his belly tucked in. He is like so mindful of that. So women, and individuals who are using corset, it actually constricts the lungs from functioning properly so that you can have proper respiration. There are many errors in the present style of female dress. It is injurious to health and therefore sin for females to wear tight corsets or to compress the waist. They are dissatisfied with nature's arrangements, and in their earnest efforts to correct nature and bring her to her ideas of congeniality, they break down her work and leave her a mere wreck. So you have, say this is the anatomy of a woman's body, nice, and everything is normal here. But from the time she starts wearing this corset continuously, the body takes shape of it. And what do you see happening to her ribs and the other organs? Look at the colon here, transverse colon, nice across. But in this one, it's pushed down. And this causes a lot of problems with women, especially later on in years where the body sort of sags. You find that it can cause restriction on the bladder function. The colon is now compromised here. The lungs cannot expand freely for proper respiration. The stomach could be affected and you can have digestive issues. A lot of things can happen with the compression that is placed upon the body by the corset. So these corsets have a depressing influence upon the heart, liver, and lungs. The health of the entire system depends upon the healthy action of the respiratory organs. Thousands of females have ruined their constitutions and brought upon themselves various diseases in their effort to make a healthy and natural form unhealthy and unnatural. So what about shoes? Let's have a look. So we have different kinds of shoes, those with the tall heels and the extra tall heels. When individuals wear these tall heel shoes, you find that the spine actually begins to curve and take on a different form. And if a woman are wearing shoes, it should rather be whole shoes. You see these with the straps and all the feet exposed, it will be cold. Your feet will be cold and chilled. And so for one reason, you want to be able to close that up, wear whole shoes that's closed up right the way around so that your feet is warmer. Secondly, for the filth on the streets, or as you walk, all your feet is taking up dust, and any water and so forth can get into your toes. You can later get fungus or infection. Another thing with these high heels, even though they're closed shoes or opened shoes, the high heels is very unstable. The bulk of the woman's weight is dependent on these little half-inch uh, wide heels with such height as 4 to 6 or 8 inches tall. And you're very much as if you're on stilts. So your body takes on a different shape. It's sort of tilt forward, the butt sticking out, and it's not comfortable. A lot of women can stand on these things, and their ankles can rock, the back here with their heel and ankles can rock left to right because it's not stable enough. Your shoes should be so stable that if you had to run for your life, you can do so quite easily with what you're wearing. And so the tall, high heel shoes would not afford you that. So when you stand in your shoe, ask yourself honestly, is this stable enough? You'd find that the heel should be a bit more thicker and solid, firm, set on the floor. We do have some guidance here that you need to protect your feet in all seasons, whether it is winter or summer, whether it is dry, hot, and cold. And so if it is wet weather, you want to wear resistant boots or shoes that would not absorb the wet. So if you're wearing a cloth fabric shoe and it gets wet, your feet will be wet as compared to if your shoe was made of leather that water could bounce off, or some other synthetic material it would bounce off. And make sure that the boots have or the shoe has a lot of room around, that it is not tight by the toe area, and you don't want make sure that the boots are plenty loose about the calf of the leg. So this is if the boots is high and tall, you want a lot of room around the ankle area as well as the calf area, so that the legs is not pressing against this boot all the time, that you do have some room for movement in there. If it's cold, you want to wear socks in that shoe that is of a breathable fabric, preferably, which would be like cotton or wool, so that your feet is not too hot, but yet still comfortable and warm. So socks should be like a half-inch longer than the foot, so it's not constrained and too tight. Your shoes should be of leather rather than the synthetic materials, because synthetic can cause the feet to be too hot and sweat within the shoe. So your shoes should also recognize that when you have these tall heels, you actually put a lot of pressure on the calf area. Right behind the calf area here, you have the calf pump, which actually, as you walk, your feet and your heel, when it hits the ground, it sort of constricts the blood in that calf pump area here, sending the blood back up to the heart. And so, but when you're up on heels like this, the step is disrupted, your walk is disrupted, and then that calf, the pump to send that blood back up to the heart, does not work properly, and you can have problems with your feet swelling because blood is more congested down in here and in the foot area, and it's not getting back up. So you can have a lot of issues with that. There is a style of shoe that causes a lot of problems for individuals, and that can cause hammer toes. If the shoe is too tight, you find you can get bunions and the corns and so forth, ingrown nails. But at the same time, let's have a look at a certain kind of shoe that can squeeze the toes and give you what you call hammer toes. So these shoes, what we call stilettos, or some folks, would think it's like a little weapon here that can kill the cockroach or some insect that's in a corner. But this is what these stilettos, when men also have shoes like this, and they too get the same problem because it's not taking the proper shape of the foot. So your shoe should take the shape of your feet. And one of the experiments that you can do is to take a piece of paper, put your foot flat down, draw the outline of your foot, and then take your shoe, put it on top of that, and draw the outline of your shoe. And you will see how narrow your shoe is compared to the width of your feet. And that just gives you an idea of how much constriction we're giving our feet with certain kinds of shoes. So you want your shoe to be closer to the width of your foot, your feet, and at the same time to take the shape, that rounded shape at the front of your feet. So here's what the hammer toes look like. Okay, so you have it where it's squeezed in so that this toe actually lodges itself on the top, and you do have to do some surgical procedure to try to bring it back in good shape and form, simply by wearing that kind of pointed tip shoe, and it happens to both male and female. So the orthopedic surgeon has actually reported that 800 patients who underwent surgery for bunions, 94 were women, 6 were men, and for surgeries for hammer toes, out of 850 surgeries, 80 were for women, the rest for men, obviously. And so it requires surgery to correct that. So in conclusion, as we wrap up here, what are some pointers that we need to remember? When shopping for clothes, these are the standards, which the clothing or the fabric, if you're sewing your clothing or sewing, you're going to do your shopping, this is what you need to consider. You want to look for good quality. Your clothing should be durable, suited for service, warm, and not that it's exposing you to the chill and the cold. It should be protective, meaning that it is covering the limbs. It's covering your limbs. And then it's suitable and becoming in its color. It's not expensive. It has appropriate length. All right, and that would constitute some of the guidelines that you should follow. A lot of times individuals would say, well, it's too hot. You're saying to cover the limbs, the advice is given. Now, it's not me saying, I'm just reading the information to you. The advice is given to cover your limbs, but it's so hot. Yes, it is hot, but understand that when it is hot, where are you cooler? Under a shady tree or out in the hot sun? So you would say, well, I'll be cooler under a shady tree. So remember that your clothing acts like a shady tree to you, even though it is hot. When it is hot, you don't go drink cold water to cool down. You drink room temperature water, and that would keep you cool. If you drank cold water, your body has to sort of generate a lot of heat to warm and cool down that water that you're putting within your system. And so by all that exertion, you become hotter even. So you want to have clothing to cover, even if it is hot, but the quality of the fabric is important. So if the fabric is breathable, you will be cool. So wearing cotton that is loose, fitting, so you will be able to feel cool and not hot. Observe that in countries where the weather is very hot, the clothing is usually loose fitting so that breeze could pass through, and their body is covered well, their limbs are covered too. But the fabric that is used, it is a light breathable cotton that is used. So you have cotton, wool, silk, linen, bamboo. Those are breathable material examples. And when you avoid using polyesters, nylon, those synthetics, rayons, and so forth, those synthetic fabrics that will trap heat and cause you to feel hot. You want to also look for light colors. So the white and the cream, light colors that would reflect the heat rather than draw it to the body. So if you were to follow these guidelines and get a cotton, one of the things that I've recognized is that if you have cotton close to the skin, it keeps you cool because that cotton will absorb any perspiration and and not leave it on your skin. And so I always recognize our men who are on the pulpit on the Sabbath, and they're thoroughly clothed with their jackets and their outfits, and they're not fanning away at themselves as the women are, who are wearing less clothing. And one of the things that a lot of men would do is to have the white cotton on the t-shirts. And when they do so, that tends to keep them cooler. So they can be wearing a lot of fabric in their suit outfits, but because of the cotton t-shirt underneath, they are kept cool. And our ladies can do the same. You can have the long sleeve cotton on the t-shirt, and if it is that you didn't even have a breathable fabric over that, you would still be kept cool. But and I'm just sharing this as you transition. You may not have everything within reach and to use, but you want to begin, implementing. Go out and get those cotton undershirts, and as you wear them, you would actually see the difference that it gives. So wearing long sleeves in summer and winter also prevents the alarm reaction of the adrenals, that you don't get this chill and this cold. So even if a light sleeve is worn in the warm weather, you would still be fine. And so you also want to keep the head cool while in the sun. So some folks will wear like a hat, a straw hat, avoiding the midday sun when possible. But that's what a lot of people would do. But we know that if you do go out in the midday sun, you'll actually be making a lot more vitamin D. You want to eat lighter foods. Or once you have fruits and vegetables, they contain water within them, and at the same time, they help you to keep cool, and your body would keep cool. Drinking lots of water, you will be a cool person. You always find that a total vegetarian person, they are cooler, their body temperature is lower, and they don't feel as hot as someone who would eat the flesh food. Because such individuals, their metabolism would be greater in trying to break down that food, the flesh foods, and they work up a heat more compared to someone who's a total vegetarian and drinking lots of water, having your fruits and veggies and so forth. So the imperishable ornament, that there is an ornament that will never perish, that will promote the happiness of all around us in this life and will shine with undimmed luster in the immortal future. So let me reread this. There is an ornament that would never perish, that would promote the happiness of all around us in this life and will shine with undimmed luster in the immortal life, future. It is the adorning of a meek and lowly spirit, and God has bidden us wear the richest dress upon the soul. So not on the body and outer garment, but upon the soul. So why is it so hard to lead a self-denying, humble life? Because professed Christians are not dead to the world. It is easy living after we are dead, but many are longing for the leeks and onions of Egypt. They have a disposition to dress and act as much like the world as possible, and yet go to heaven. Such will have no excuse. Many dress like the world to have an influence, but here they make a sad and fatal mistake. If they would have a true and saving influence, let them live out their profession, show their faith by their righteous works, and make the distinction between the Christian and the world. I saw that the words, the dress, and the actions should tell for God. Let a holy influence be shed upon all, and all will take knowledge of them that they have been with Jesus. Unbelievers, they are not foolish. They will see that the truth we profess has a holy influence, and that faith in Christ's coming affects the character of the man or woman. If any wish to have their influence tell in favor of the truth, let them live it out and thus imitate the humble pattern. You are different, God's command, and He has called us to be different from the world. He is not coming to save us in our sin, but to save us from that sin. And so He wants us to live out the true Christian life. And when individuals see that, they would be called to something different. How if you are to do just like they do? They're not going to be called to anything that's different, so they very well won't see the difference and think that they can stay where they are. But it is a different teaching altogether, and if we're not sharing that, then our influence is not in the right place. The love of dress endangers the morals and makes woman the opposite of the Christian lady, characterized by modesty and sobriety. Instead, showy, extravagant dress too often encourages lust in the heart of the wearer and awakens base passions in the heart of the beholder. In another place, she calls the worldly fashions demoralizing and say that many women will stoop to dishonesty, theft, and even sell their virtue to be fashionably dressed. Fashions do not always come from heaven, neither do they always come from the pure, the virtuous, and the good. So remember that, because there are some fashions that are not for the Christian. So when we go after the fashions, we should rather be safe. We use a lot of money and expense in this area, and every dollar that is saved by denying ourselves of these useless ornaments should rather be given to the needy, or maybe placed in the Lord's treasury to sustain the gospel and to send missionaries to foreign countries, to multiply publications, to carry rays of light to souls in the darkness of error. So we are also called to dress for the sanctuary, because our dress, like I say, we're not Christians for a day when you go to church, but throughout the week. But even when on the Sabbath or at any time you're going into the sanctuary, how do we wear our clothing and how do we go before God in His house? So the God of heaven is honored or dishonored by the apparel of those who officiate in His honor. Instructions to Moses for priestly garments was for glory and for beauty, to give a sense of holiness of God and sacredness of His worship and purity of those in His presence. So the influence of the minister who is careless in his dress is displeasing to God. And I found this to be quite interesting. The influence of the minister who is careless in his dress is displeasing to God. And it's not just the pastor here, but any officiating member. If it is that your dress is, you're careless about your dress and you're not observing dress reform and you're going up before God's children, it's displeasing to God that you're before and in his congregation and administering in an appropriate garment. They're rather to set, but here our ministers and our leaders are rather to set an example that would help men and women to reach a high standard and understand that's what God has called us to, a higher standard, to lift us up from the pull of sin, that sin has kept us down. And so there are many various passages of scripture that one can look at that would talk about, the dress and what is an abomination unto the Lord. For example, Jeremiah, they were ashamed when they committed abomination. They were not all ashamed. Nay, they were not all ashamed neither. Could they blush? Therefore they shall fall among them that fall. At the time that I visit them, they shall be cast down, said the Lord. So we need not to be bold in our sinful state or our choices, but rather go and be humble before God. God's loyal people are a light to the world. You're salt to the earth. We need to remember that your influence is of value and that we are to exchange the extreme long or the extreme short dress, that we would to a great extent destroy our influence if we were to do that, have the extremes. But believers whom it is their duty to benefit and seek to bring to the Lamb of God would be disgusted when they look at us. So many improvements can be made in the dress of our females in reference to health without going to that extreme that is too long or too short. And we are told also, reminded, to love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. And if the fashion is of the world and becoming of worldly taste and preferences and so forth, and it does not fall in harmony with God's guidelines, then we are going after the world, all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. It is not of the Father, but of the world. So it's not of God, and that's why every article of clothing out there or fashion out there is not for the Christian. We need to be selective. And God has been testing his people. He allowed the testimony concerning dress to become silent. So that's why you don't hear, you haven't heard a lot about dress reform in times past, nor even today, because way back from 1881, when God gave the last description of dress, that was it. He hasn't come back and hop on the matter. Why? That our sisters might show their own inclination and thus develop the real pride existing in their hearts. So we have laid it out. God has laid out the guidelines, and he's left it up to individuals to be selective, to take their stand as to what they want to do. Do you want to live your life and this, in terms of your dressing? We've talked about eating, drinking, dressing, and its influence on health. And do you want, even in your dressing, to reflect the true character of Christ, or to do your own thing? Is what you're doing going to please him or please yourself and the world? So it is a test to everyone that our sisters might follow their own inclination and thus develop the real pride existing in their hearts. A lot of times what we wear, what we put on our bodies, it's all for display and, And it's really a pride thing if you were to be honest with yourself and think, why am I doing this? And if there's no good purpose, then check if whether there's some element of pride within it, of elevation or esteeming yourself within it, then that is not of God. But it was to prevent also the present state of worldliness that the dress reform was recommended. Many scorned the idea that this dress was unnecessary to preserve them from following the fashions, but the Lord has permitted them to prove that pride was cherished in their hearts and that this was thus what they would do. It is now shown that they needed the restriction which the reform dress imposed, because if we were so restricted to follow the reform dress like a uniform, then we would be within that realm. But allow us to freely choose, and we are going miles away. However, the message is still there as to the guidelines. And if we are not so proud and haughty within ourselves, but rather be humble to God and submit to His bidding, then we would be in a better place. So He knows the end from the beginning, who understands our nature and our needs. Our compassionate Redeemer saw our dangers and difficulties and has given us timely warning and instruction concerning habits of life, even the proper selection of food and clothing. If you look at in nature, it's so beautiful that we are told that if you, why take thought of your raiment? Sometimes we give too much thought about what to wear, and you have a wardrobe full of clothes and you're fussing about what to wear. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow and toil not, neither do they spin. Yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Again, simplicity will help you out a great deal. So a note here on the question, is fashion a spiritual problem? It's a very key question. Is fashion a spiritual problem? Well, Testimonies Volume 4, page 647 actually tells us that fashion is deteriorating the intellect and eating out the spirituality of our people. Obedience to fashion is pervading our Seventh-day Adventist churches and is doing more than any other power to separate our people from God. And I think that's a huge problem. And it's eating away at our spirituality, and it's actually separating us from God. So let us not be caught in the net of fashion. Just an observation here, as we can start it off, we will conclude that in the beginning, when the sinful pair wore no artificial garment, they actually had a covering of light. What do we have? They were in a state of no sin, so they were sinless. So the sinless pair, they had a covering of light about their body, such as the angels wear, and they were happy. But after sin, their eyes were opened, and they saw that they were what? They were naked. And you see that no sin, you're covered. Sin, you're naked. And that is what sin does to us. Wants to strip us and take our clothing away, our covering away, our covering of righteousness, our covering of purity, of holiness, of connection to God. Sin strips and takes away even our physical covering. It did for Adam and Eve, and that is what sin does to us, want to take away even our physical covering. So you found now that God, in their sinful choice and selection, choosing an apron was not cover enough, that God went on to cover them with the coat that He made. Then you even look at in Luke chapter 8, when Jesus went out to the Gadarenes, He met a man there who was demon possessed. And what does the Bible say? He was a certain man which had devils a long time, and he wore no clothes. Again, sin, connection, no clothing. And, he was not in his right mind. Anybody in their right mind would cover up. But people who are not in their right mind just want to strip away at the clothing and wear less and less clothing and no clothing at all. And so on. Are you demon possessed in your thinking? Or what about the persons who are inventing these fashions? It is demon possession. We're told that Satan invented the fashions that leave the limbs exposed. So what? It's possession by Satan that's doing these fashions. So let us not be caught there. And so that's what he wants to do, strip us of our clothing again. Notice that the man, after God intervened, Jesus intervened, they found him that he was sitting at the feet of Jesus. He had on clothes, and the Bible went on to say, look here in verse 35, the devils departed, and he was found sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and what? In his right mind. When you're in your right mind, you're going to be covered. The sin is taken away, covering comes again. And this is what God wants to do for us. He wants us to be covered, be in our right mind, and physical clothing has a lot to do with that as well. So let us not, by the time we start stripping away at our clothing and wearing less and exposing the limbs and so forth, we are actually pulling ourselves further away from Christ, and that's not a good place to be. If you observe ancient Israel, their garment, all these folks lived in the east. You had times of winter for some areas. You also had hot sun, but they were covered. And we're here in the West, we don't dress like this, but these folks, ancient Israel, they were covered. Today we are spiritual Israel and God, modern Israel, and God wants us, he has given us a dress reform message and called us to be covered. So in the Middle East, the culture is such that they are still covered today. And the thing about what I found in understanding the dress reform a little bit more better too, is that as you start looking at other cultures and seeing what they have done and are doing, and then you see what God has to say about lots of subject matters, and you look to see what the world was back in such time when these messages were given, then you could understand better, what was spoken about. So back in, say, in the Middle Eastern countries, you still do have people that wear a lot of covering. For example, here you have a headscarf, and this was actually, used being out here in the desert to protect your head from the dust as you move around, and the dust would blow, that you could protect your head. It's a light cotton fabric, because this is actually me, and at one time I pulled it over my face because we were in a vehicle and the dust was just flying into my eyes, and I could still see through the fabric because it was such a light cotton, and it's black, but I could see through clearly everything because it was a light fabric, and you could actually see individuals could wear this and not be hot, even though they're out there in the sun. To climb onto this camel, you'll have to have a wide enough skirt to get on, but even when they would say that you have to wear pants on this journey to be able to do the activities and so forth, you can be going in your dress reform clothing. You have your skirt, you have the pants underneath, and you're able to get over your legs over the camel, to ride a camel, a horse, or anything, and have your fabric of the garment draped on the sides and not expose your body. You find that in, as we look back at these cultures, people would climb mountains, go on hikes, do gardening and everything in their long dress. And they didn't have to change and say, oh, let me wear a pants like a man. No, they didn't. And so if they can do it back then, there's nothing absurd about us doing it now. The thing is, within our culture, we're not accustomed generally across the board to be wearing the longer garment, that it may seem kind of odd if we begin to do so or engage in all these activities. Doing that, you exercise with your long dress or skirt, as when you don't have to exercise in pants. So all these things, the woman, as we talked earlier about dressing in the sanctuary, here you have these Muslim women, and to go into this temple, you have to be covered. And so everyone, as they were going, this was like a tourist attraction site, so you had to visit. And going in there to visit, they actually had a room at the entry point where you were inspected to see if you were covered enough to enter into their mosque. And these people take that so seriously that, we just would throw on anything and walk into God's house. And you're worshiping the true and living God. But here they are very particular. You're going into the mosque, you have to be covered. The woman got to be covered. From your head, you must be covered. Down to your toes, you must, well, the toes could be exposed. You're walking bare feet if you don't have on socks. But your ankles were not to be seen. No ankles must be showing. So the garment must be long to cover the ankles, and your neck should not be exposed. So there's no chance about cleavage showing hair in this custom wear. But just to share with you, how they do it. So they didn't want your sleeves had to be way down, and then your neck shouldn't show, and your ankle shouldn't not show. And if it is that you turned up there and you had inappropriate garment, they would tell you where they have these gowns on racks, and they're one size fits all. So they'll put it on you, and you had to wear it to go any further. There was security and everything, and you had to wear this. So men and women, as long as you weren't properly got, you had to wear these long clothing. Thankfully for dress reform, I didn't have to wear their clothing, and it was all well and good. So remember that we are a chosen generation, all a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. We are royalty, and God has given us, when I talk to folks about the way we eat, we have a 3-course meal. So you have your starter, your main, and you end your meal with the fat. So you have a 3-course meal. That's for breakfast and for your lunch meal. And then you also dress like royalty. It's pretty cold today, and the colors I wore out there, somebody looked at me and they said, wow, you look like Christmas in July, because, it was some reds and so forth. But it stood out. It was recognizable as being different, but yet it was tasteful. And, so you do fall in line, but at the same time, there is beauty in it. So you dress like royalty. And if you think that way, then you would not think it to be a burden to follow dress reform at all. You would really enjoy doing it. So I just want to take you quickly to a state, a country called Bhutan. And, it's up in some hilly area. But I was amazed to see how, again, in the east, these people dress. The Bhutan just around China, Nepal, bordering there. And here, this is the queen of that little country, Bhutan, and she wears long clothing. Now, it's a bit pretty much colorful, for modesty and simplicity and so forth, but the whole thing is to show you even someone in dressing like royalty, wearing covered. This is the picture on the wedding day, and she's covered, and that's how she would go about being dressed, covered, and the men too. So these young ladies covered, and let's think about dressing like royalty. So here are a few pictures of the long dress. This is like simple. Here you have another with simplicity. Notice the arms are covered, the legs are covered, button up to the neck so you don't have the chest area exposed. This particular lady here, she has on a boot, and so the end of the skirt just meets where the boot ends, and so you don't have any of the legs covering. One of the things with selecting your shoes, for folks, especially in winter and cold, you would wear boots. But here in the Caribbean, you don't think about wearing boots. But wear the whole closed up shoe, and then, you think about that top of your instep. If you are in the air-conditioned area, it could be chilled quite easily. So you would need like a socks or stocking that's warm enough to make sure that your entire feet is kept warm. So especially if you're working in an air-conditioned environment, I would say find warm clothing. Invest in warm clothing. Go to some foreign country where they're selling warm clothing and buy warm clothing as if you're dressing for winter. If you're working in an air-conditioned environment and it is cold, you have to dress properly in order to maintain your blood circulation and good health. And once you're dressed warmly with these winter kind fabrics, and you have the proper shoe and you have socks on your feet, or there's some thick stockings with some insulation on the inside or something like that, you'd be fine, and you wouldn't be fidgety for the cold. But you really need to seriously invest and buy some warm clothing. There's some shawls and coverings that are of fleece material that you can drape over you while you're doing your work and you're warm. Once you are going out, you could strip those things off and you still are modest with your clothing underneath, but make sure that you're kept warm. This looks quite modern, doesn't it? But yet it is fits all the description for what true dress reform would call us to. And so that's the thing, it doesn't have to be looking old-fashioned, even though fashion is all of a perception and it rolls over. But the thing is, it's modest and it covers the body. Here's another Christian lady, and again, so these are simple clothing. Here you have some Christian ladies, and and this is the author, Gwen Shorter, for some of the books that I recommended that we read. One of them on jewelry, the spiritualism connection, and the other on dress. It says, it is titled, Thy Nakedness, Lord, What Shall I Wear? So these are some of our Christian sisters displaying, true dress reform. And there, at the end, when Jesus comes, he is going to clothe us finally, and we wouldn't have to be fussing about all of these things. But we need to be receptive now of his selection of our clothing. What shall we wear? If we are expected to be happy with his selection of our clothing in the future, in the new earth. So in Revelation 7:9, we're told that we would be clothed with white robes. And in Revelation 7:13 again, these are they which are arrayed in white robes. So we will have our robe, and a robe is like full covering, and we would be happy. And Revelation 7:14 emphasizes they have washed their robes and made them white. So that's talking about now, what we do now, physically as well as spiritually. So let us embrace the Lord's plan for our lives, the dress that He has chosen for us. And as long as we choose to follow the Lord, choose to do what He requires, we would be pleasing Him and not pleasing ourselves. So let our aim be to please our Creator. So these are some books that's recommended that I just spoke about by Gwen and Rick Shorter. And you can get these online and actually use them for further reading. And they would, they have a lot of research and details, some of which we shared with you in this presentation, but a whole lot more. That it's two great books that you should really get within your library. It's worth it. This is another one covered, Dressed for the End in Mind, and then you also have Joe Cruz, Creeping Compromise, that covers some information as well. Testimonies, Volume 1, Chapter 83, Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, Chapter 62, and then Amazing Facts have within their library a free book on colorful cosmetics and jewelry by Joe Cruz. And so those are some of the recommended further reading. So this brings us to the end of our discussion on the dress reform.